The locked trunk in my attic wasn't my mother's. The attic of my childhood home had always felt like another world to me. Quiet, dusty, filled with the scent of old wood and yellowed pages. As a child, I'd spent hours up there, exploring every box, every trunk, every forgotten object, tucked beneath the slanted roof. I knew every corner of that space, every floorboard that creaked underfoot, every cobweb hanging in the corners of the rafters. After Dad died 3 years ago, I'd climbed up there several times, but could never bring myself to sort through his belongings. It was too painful to touch items that still held his scent and memories. But now that the house needed to be sold, I had no choice. That's why, when I climbed up there on a cold October morning in 2024, I immediately noticed it. A trunk, heavy, with dark peeling wood and iron corners. I was absolutely certain it hadn't been there before. After all these years living in this house, I knew every item in the attic by heart, and this trunk had definitely appeared recently. Maybe Dad had moved it up here shortly before his death, when I was no longer living with my parents. It sat in the farthest corner, behind the old Christmas tree we decorated every year. There was less dust on it than on the neighboring items, which confirmed my suspicion. It had been brought up here relatively recently. The lock had rusted, but the hinges still held tight. The metal felt warm to the touch, as if the trunk had recently been stored in a heated room. I had to work for almost half an hour with a screwdriver and hammer before the lid opened with a quiet groan, as if exhaling air that had been trapped there for decades. Inside, items were folded neatly, as if they'd been packed with love by someone who knew that someday someone would look inside. Everything was wrapped in tissue paper and layered with lavender sachets. Someone had taken great care to preserve these belongings. Women's clothing from the 1950s, dresses with full taffeta and silk skirts, elegant silk gloves that reached the elbow, an old wool coat with black fox fur on the collar. In the coat pocket lay a bottle of Chanel No. 5, half empty, but still releasing its delicate fragrance. Everything smelled of dried flowers and time, but also something indefinably sad. At the very bottom, wrapped in a silk scarf, lay a small wooden box. Inside were letters tied with a satin ribbon. The paper had yellowed at the edges. Ink had smudged in places from time and perhaps tears. The handwriting was feminine, clear, neat, with elegant flourishes that were taught in proper girls' schools. They were addressed to a woman named Evelyn Harris, a surname that meant nothing to me, but something about it seemed familiar, as if I'd heard it somewhere before. Beneath the letters, I found a stack of black and white photographs, also tied with ribbon. The first showed a young woman about 25, with a gentle smile and attentive eyes. She sat in a garden under an apple tree, sunlight playing in her dark hair. In her arms, she held a girl about 5 years old, delicate, with large, serious eyes. The girl looked incredibly like me at that same age. I pulled out my phone and compared the photo to my own childhood picture. The resemblance was striking. The same eye shape, the same stubborn chin line, the same cowlick on top that never wanted to lie flat. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a trick of imagination. But the longer I stared at the photo, the more a chill spread through my chest. The resemblance wasn't just striking, It was frightening. I studied the remaining photographs. In one, the same woman stood next to a man in military uniform, tall, with dark hair and familiar features. Features I saw every day in the mirror and recognized in my father's face. The man had his arm around the woman's waist, and both looked at the camera with that special tenderness that only truly happy people have. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "Tom and Evelyn, honeymoon, Lake Michigan, August 1954. My father's name was Tom, Thomas Harper." My hands began to shake. I flipped through the photographs one by one, as if they could tell me the story I'd never heard. Evelyn in a wedding dress next to Dad in a suit. Evelyn with a newborn baby girl in the hospital. The same girl taking first steps down a garden path. A family Christmas. Evelyn and Tom smiling as they watched the little one unwrap presents under the tree. This was a life I'd never known about. A family that existed before me. I continued searching the trunk, hoping to find something that would explain this discovery. In a side pocket sewn into the lining, my fingers found another item, a small envelope, sealed and never opened. On the envelope was written that this letter was intended for his daughter when she grew up. The handwriting was masculine. I recognized Dad's writing. Inside lay a folded sheet of paper and another photograph. In the picture, Dad stood beside a hospital bed where the same dark-haired woman lay with a newborn baby in her arms. He looked incredibly young, no more than 25, but his eyes held so much tenderness and pride that my heart clenched with pain. In the letter, Dad wrote to his dear Mary that if she was reading these lines, it meant he could no longer protect her himself. He asked her to know that every day they spent apart, he thought of her. He reminded her that her mama loved her more than anything in the world and wanted her daughter to grow up strong and fair. He hoped she had succeeded and signed himself as the papa who never stopped loving her. Mary. So the girl in the photographs was named Mary. Among the old envelopes and documents, I discovered a yellowed newspaper clipping, carefully folded between the pages of an old Bible. The headline announced the tragic death of a young wife that shocked the community. The article was short, but every word hit like a hammer. It reported that Evelyn Harris, 27, a young mother and local women's club activist, had died in a car accident on the evening of October 15th, 1959, on Highway 41 near Chicago. It explained that Mrs. Harris was returning home from a doctor's appointment when her car collided with a truck on the rain-slicked road. The article stated that the deceased's husband, Thomas Harper, 26, a mechanic at an auto shop, and their 5-year-old daughter Mary, had sustained serious injuries but were, according to doctors, out of danger. It noted that the family was known in the area for their active community involvement. The article concluded by saying that the funeral would be held Saturday at St. Patrick's Church, and instead of flowers, the family requested donations to an education fund for needy children. I read the article again and again, trying to process what I'd learned. My father had been married before he met my mother. He had a daughter who would now be about 70 years old, and he had never, not once, mentioned any of this. I went down to Dad's study where he'd spent long evenings reading and working on documents. This study had always been his sanctuary. You weren't allowed to enter without knocking, and even Mom only cleaned there in his presence. Now I understood why. I began methodically going through his documents, every drawer, every folder. In the old desk, in the farthest drawer, among tax receipts and insurance policies, I found a worn leather address book. Most of the entries were familiar. Colleagues from the factory, where Dad had worked for 20 years after moving from Chicago. Neighbors, Mom's relatives, old friends. But on one of the last pages, written in pencil in almost illegible handwriting, was St. Catherine's Academy, 1247 Elm Street, New Haven, Connecticut, and next to it, Mary Harris. Below the address, in small handwriting, were dates and information. September 1960, enrolled at Academy. December 1960, excellent grades in all subjects. March 1961, participates in school choir. The entries continued for years, the information becoming more detailed. The last entry was dated December 2020. Mary became partner at Campbell & Associates, first woman in the firm's 150-year history. My heart began beating faster. Dad didn't just know where his daughter was. He'd been following her life. He knew about her achievements. He collected information about every one of her accomplishments. But why had he never told me about this? In the same drawer, under a stack of old letters from the insurance company, I found something even more shocking. A thick folder labeled indicating these were personal documents that should not be opened. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, photographs from publications, copies of school bulletins, an entire life monitored from afar. The clippings were from St. Catherine's Academy's school newspaper. They reported Mary's academic successes, her participation in school plays, her victories in debates. One article stated that Mary Harris was exceptionally talented and dreamed of becoming a lawyer to defend people oppressed by the powerful. There were also photographs, obviously cut from school yearbooks and newspapers. Mary at her academy graduation in a white dress and cap. A photo from the local paper. Mary on a Harvard campus bench. A shot from the university bulletin. Mary on her wedding day with a tall, blonde man outside an elegant church. A photo from Boston Society pages. On the back of each clipping, Dad had written short notes about how his girl had grown into a beauty, how she looked so much like Evelyn at that age, how he hoped she was happy. The most painful was a letter written in Dad's hand but never sent. It was dated 2018. In it, Dad addressed his dear Mary, explaining that he would soon turn 80 and understood that he didn't have much time left. He wrote that every day he wondered whether he'd done the right thing by disappearing from her life. Probably not, he admitted, but he'd had no choice then. He wanted her to be safe, even if it meant he'd never see her again. Dad wrote that she'd become exactly what her mama had dreamed she would be. Strong, fair, able to stand up for herself and others. He was prouder of her than words could express. He mentioned that he had another daughter. Her name was Catherine. "She's 30 years younger than you," he wrote, "but you're so similar in character. She also fights for justice. Also can't walk past someone else's trouble." At the end of the letter, Dad expressed hope that if we ever met, we would find in each other the family he couldn't give us. He signed as the father who loved her every day of his life. The letter was written, signed, even placed in an envelope with an address, but never sent. On the envelope was a note saying this was too dangerous, that they might find out. Who were they, and why did Dad consider it dangerous to contact his own daughter even 40 years after disappearing? The next day, I called St. Catherine's Academy. The woman on the other end, Mrs. Elizabeth Morgan, as she introduced herself, was polite but cautious. She confirmed that their archives did indeed contain records of a student named Mary Harris, who attended there from 1960 to 1972. Mrs. Morgan told me that Mary had been an exceptional student, one of the best in the Academy's history. She graduated with a gold medal and received a full scholarship to Harvard, but she warned that they only provided details about graduates with an official request or their personal consent. I explained that Mary was my half-sister and that I was trying to contact her. Mrs. Morgan paused, then said something strange. She noted that in all the years she'd worked there, 30 years now, no one had ever called about Mary Harris. This was quite unusual for such an outstanding graduate, she explained. Usually, classmates search for each other, organize reunions. But Mary, she seemed to have vanished from all connections to her past after graduation. These words made me doubt even more what had happened with our family in those distant years. Why had a successful, sociable girl completely severed ties with the school where she'd spent 12 years? I decided to turn to professionals. I found a private investigator online, James Crowley, an elderly man with kind eyes in his photo, who specialized in finding missing people and restoring family connections. His office was in an old Boston neighborhood in a red brick building that remembered pre-war times. Crowley listened to my story attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. He was a man of about 70, with gray hair and attentive gray eyes that seemed to have seen too much human drama. He said such cases were his specialty. Families destroyed by circumstances, children who'd lost contact with parents. But there was something unusual about my case, he noted. The detective pointed to Dad's letter that he'd never dared send. He explained that my father had been afraid, so afraid that he'd preferred to lose his daughter forever, rather than put her in danger. In his practice, this happened either in cases of organized crime or when very influential people were acting against a family. Crowley promised to begin searching immediately. He had connections in various archives and databases. He could obtain information unavailable to ordinary people. 3 days later, he called me with preliminary results that knocked me off my feet. Mary Harris was alive. She was 70 years old, lived in a prestigious Boston neighborhood under the surname Campbell, and was a partner at the major law firm Campbell, Rosenberg and Associates. She had 2 adult children, a son who was a cardiac surgeon, and a daughter who taught at Harvard Business School, and 4 grandchildren. And most amazingly, she was very wealthy. Crowley told me, looking through his notes, that my sister was one of the most influential female lawyers in New England. She specialized in corporate law, represented the interests of major companies. Her wealth was estimated at $8 to $10 million. She lived in a mansion on Beacon Hill, worth at least $3 million. Crowley showed me printouts from the internet, articles about Mary in legal journals, photographs from various high society Boston events. The pictures showed an elegant woman with gray hair in expensive suits, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to power and respect. The detective told me she'd married in 1975 to Richard Campbell III, heir to an old Boston family whose roots went back to the first settlers. His family owned textile factories, real estate, had connections with bankers and politicians. Richard had died 5 years ago from a heart attack, leaving her his entire fortune. But most interesting was what Crowley discovered in the St. Catherine's Academy archives. Officially, Mary had enrolled there as a complete orphan, with her maternal grandparents, William and Margaret Harris, named as guardians. The detective noted an interesting detail. The Academy documents stated that the girl's parents had died in a car accident in October 1959. Both parents, no mention that the father had survived. This explained why Mary was so certain she'd been left a complete orphan. She'd been told from childhood that her father had died along with her mother. When Crowley tried to contact Mary on my behalf, her reaction was even more shocking than I'd expected. She didn't just refuse to talk, she flew into a rage. Through her personal attorney, an elderly man named Edward Thornton, who represented the interests of Boston's wealthiest families, she conveyed that she considered any attempts to contact her fraud. Moreover, she threatened to sue for harassment if the contacts didn't cease immediately. The attorney wrote in an official letter that his client had lost her parents at an early age and had been raised by loving grandparents until their deaths. She had no living relatives and reacted extremely poorly to attempts to exploit her wealth under the pretense of fictitious kinship. But Crowley was an experienced man. He suggested not pressing, but gathering irrefutable proof of kinship. He explained that people of her position don't trust words. They need facts, documents, scientific evidence. If we provided her with DNA analysis and archival documents, she couldn't dismiss the truth. First, we went to the Cook County Archives in Chicago, where the accident had occurred. What we discovered there completely overturned my understanding of what had happened to our family in those distant years. Police reports indeed showed that Thomas Harper had been injured in an accident with his wife and daughter on October 15, 1959. Evelyn died on the scene from head trauma and internal bleeding. Tom suffered a concussion, a broken left arm, and multiple bruises. 5-year-old Mary had head trauma, a broken collarbone, and bruises. But her life wasn't in danger. But just 3 days after the accident, something happened that changed this family's life forever. On October 18, 1959, Evelyn's parents, William Harris, 52, the owner of a chain of textile factories, and his wife Margaret, 49, filed a petition in Cook County Family Court to terminate Thomas Harper's parental rights regarding their granddaughter. The petition alleged many things that made blood run cold. Tom was supposedly a chronic alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and child. He supposedly repeatedly left the 5-year-old daughter alone at home for entire days. Their apartment was in unsanitary condition. Tom supposedly had debts to dangerous people who threatened his family. The most terrible accusation was that the accident was Tom's fault. It was claimed that he was drunk behind the wheel, speeding, and provoked the collision that led to his wife's death. The Harris family was far from ordinary. William owned 4 textile factories in Chicago and its surroundings, employing more than 1,000 people. He was a city council member, chairman of the Industrial Development Committee, with close ties to City Hall, police, and the judicial system. He had enough money to hire the city's best lawyers and enough influence for those lawyers to achieve the desired result. Tom, however, was a simple mechanic at a small auto shop. His weekly salary was $40, less than Harris spent on lunch at a restaurant. Having just lost his wife, sustained injuries, and found himself alone with a 5-year-old child, he had neither the means for quality legal defense nor connections that could help him. The trial lasted only 2 weeks. During this time, a parade of witnesses testified against Tom. Neighbors claimed they regularly heard screams and sounds of fighting from the Harpers' apartment. Work colleagues testified that Tom often showed up to work hungover. A hospital doctor stated that Evelyn had traces of old injuries consistent with domestic violence. Tom denied all accusations. He insisted he never drank more than beer on weekends, that he never raised a hand to his wife or daughter, that their apartment was clean and cozy. He said the accident happened due to ice and poor visibility, that he was driving no faster than 35 miles per hour. But his words were drowned in the flood of accusations. The court-appointed attorney, a young man fresh out of law school, was clearly unprepared for such a serious case. He couldn't find witnesses in Tom's defense, couldn't refute the medical conclusions, couldn't prove his client's financial stability. On October 30th, 1959, exactly 2 weeks after Evelyn's death, the court ruled to terminate Thomas Harper's parental rights. Custody of Mary was transferred to her grandmother and grandfather. That same day, the girl was taken from the hospital and driven to Connecticut, to St. Catherine's Academy, one of the most prestigious private girls' schools in New England. Tuition there cost more than Tom earned in 3 years. But the story didn't end there. In the archives, we found documents showing that Tom hadn't accepted the loss of his daughter. In November 1960, a year after the accident, he hired a private detective named Frank O'Connor, a former police officer who specialized in investigating fraud and corruption. Tom wanted to prove that the accusations against him were false, that witnesses had committed perjury, that the court had been bought. O'Connor worked on the case for almost a year and a half. He found neighbors willing to testify that they'd never heard screams from the Harpers' apartment. He discovered that the doctor who diagnosed Evelyn with signs of violence had received a large research donation from the Harris Family Foundation right during the trial period. Most importantly, O'Connor found a mechanic from the auto shop who'd serviced Evelyn's car shortly before the accident. The mechanic was ready to swear that the car's braking system was in perfect condition and that the accident couldn't have been caused by the vehicle's technical condition or the driver's actions. In March 1962, Tom filed an appeal in district court demanding a case review and restoration of parental rights. He had witnesses, documents, evidence. He was sure justice would prevail. That's when what forced my father to disappear from his daughter's life forever happened. In the archives of O'Connor's detective agency, Crowley discovered a copy of the letter that changed everything. It was dated March 15th, 1962, and signed by Charles Edwards, senior partner of the law firm Edwards, Stone and Partners, one of Chicago's most influential. The letter was addressed to Thomas Harper and contained only a few lines, but every word was soaked with threat. It stated that the firm's clients, the Harris family, had been informed of Tom's attempts to challenge the court decision of October 30th, 1959. The authors strongly recommended he immediately cease any legal action in this direction. It further explained that the Harris family had significant influence in business, political, and legal circles, not only in Chicago, but throughout Illinois. Continuing his actions could lead to serious trouble for him personally and threaten his ability to earn a living in the future. The letter ended with a reminder that car accidents, unfortunately, happen quite often, especially to people who don't exercise caution. The authors expressed hope for his wisdom in this matter. The threat was veiled but absolutely clear. The Harris family was hinting that Evelyn's death might not have been accidental, and that the same thing could happen to Tom if he didn't leave them alone. O'Connor advised Tom to contact the FBI, file a complaint with the state prosecutor's office, expose corruption in the judicial system. But Tom made a different choice. In April 1962, he withdrew the appeal, paid off the detective, and disappeared from Chicago forever. He moved to Ohio, got a job as a mechanic at a small factory in a town where no one knew him, and started a new life. A year and a half later, he met my mother, Dorothy Miller, an elementary school teacher who worked at the local school. They married in 1964, and I was born in 1965. But Dad didn't forget Mary. Crowley discovered that throughout all these years, Dad had collected any available information about his daughter. He subscribed to Connecticut newspapers to read school news. Later, Boston publications, where local lawyers' successes were sometimes mentioned. He studied graduation lists, followed publications in legal journals. When Mary entered Harvard, Dad saved a newspaper article about scholarship recipients. When she got married, he cut out a photo from society pages. The wedding was an event in Boston high society. In the same trunk in the attic, I found evidence of how carefully Dad had followed his older daughter's life. He had a separate notebook where he recorded everything he managed to learn about Mary. It contained entries that on June 15, 1972, Mary graduated from the academy with a gold medal, and the newspaper wrote that she was the best student in the school's history. That, on September 3, 1972, Mary entered Harvard Law School because she wanted to become a lawyer. That, on May 12, 1975, Society pages announced Mary's engagement to Richard Campbell III, and the young man looked decent. The entries continued for decades. About Mary's wedding on September 20th, 1975, where Dad noted that the newspaper photo showed her in a wedding dress looking so much like Evelyn, and he hoped she would be happy. About the birth of a son on March 3rd, 1977, named Thomas after Richard's grandfather, but Dad found it pleasant anyway. About the birth of a daughter on August 15, 1979, Mary named her Evelyn after her mother, and Dad was glad his daughter remembered. The entries continued for decades. Dad knew about Mary's career successes, the birth of grandchildren, her husband's death. He was proud of every achievement, worried about every setback. The last entry was made 2 weeks before his death. It said that on January 10, 2021, Mary became a partner at Campbell & Associates. Articles wrote that she was the first woman to achieve such a position in this historic firm. Dad noted that she'd accomplished everything herself without outside help, and he was prouder of her than words could express. Too bad she'd never know, he wrote. Now I understood why Mary so categorically denied our kinship. She'd lived her entire life considering herself an orphan raised by loving grandparents. The thought that she'd had a living father who supposedly abandoned her was unbearable, but I couldn't leave things as they were. My sister had the right to know the truth, however painful it might be. I decided to act through Crowley, but more cautiously. Instead of direct contact, he suggested meeting with Mary's attorney and providing documentary evidence, archival certificates, police reports, DNA analysis. Edward Thornton, Mary's personal attorney, agreed to meet, but only on the condition that if the documents proved to be forgeries, his client would sue for fraud and slander. The meeting took place at the law firm Thornton and Partners in downtown Boston. The building was historic, with marble columns and high ceilings, the kind where deals that shaped American history for 2 centuries were made. Thornton himself turned out to be a man of about 70, with gray hair and penetrating eyes. He listened to our story with professional skepticism, examined every document with a magnifying glass, as if looking for forgeries. But when he saw the archival documents from Cook County, his expression changed. He said these documents were authentic. He checked the seals, signatures, dates. Moreover, he was familiar with some names in these papers. Charles Edwards had indeed been senior partner at the firm that represented the Harris family's interests. Thornton paused, then added something that made me shudder. He said he'd been a junior partner at that firm in the early 1960s. He remembered the Harper versus Harris case. Back then, rumors circulated among lawyers that the trial was predetermined, that the Harris family had paid for the desired decision. But there was no proof, and young lawyers didn't ask unnecessary questions. He agreed to pass the documents to Mary, but warned that her reaction might be unpredictable. He explained that Mrs. Campbell was a very strong woman, but even strong people sometimes break when they learn their entire life was built on lies. Mary agreed to meet with me, but only after receiving DNA test results that irrefutably confirmed our kinship. We really were half-sisters. The meeting was scheduled at a neutral location, the private Somerset Club on Beacon Hill, where Mary had been a member for 30 years. I saw her for the first time in my life, but immediately recognized her. She was taller than me, with gray hair gathered in an elegant bun, wearing an expensive navy suit. But her eyes, facial structure, even the way she held her head, everything was strikingly similar to Dad. Mary studied me with the same amazement. We sat at a corner table away from prying eyes, and for a while simply looked at each other, trying to grasp the unreality of the situation. She said I really did look like her in her youth, and like the photographs Mr. Thornton had shown her. Photographs of our father. She pronounced the word father with difficulty, as if it burned her tongue. Mary told me her version of events, the one she'd believed her entire life. It turned out that Grandpa and Grandma Harris had told her a false version of events. They said Tom had also died in that accident, but a few days after Evelyn, from injuries sustained in the hospital. That Mary had been left a complete orphan, and only loving grandparents could save her and give her a decent future. Mary grew up believing she was the sole survivor of her family, that her parents had died in a tragic accident when she was 5. She firmly believed she owed her success to her grandparents, who had sacrificed everything for her upbringing. She said she thought she was living for them, that her achievements repaid them for their love and care. And now it turned out she couldn't finish the sentence. Now it turned out her entire life had been built on a monstrous lie, that the people she considered saviors were those who destroyed her family, that the father she mourned as a hero who died in his prime had actually lived a long life, loving her from afar and dreaming of a reunion. Mary said she needed time to process all this. She wanted to independently study all the documents, conduct her own investigation. If what I was saying was true, she needed to know the whole truth, to the end. Mary was a lawyer to her core. She couldn't accept anything on faith, even if the evidence seemed irrefutable. She needed to go through the entire journey, from doubt to conviction herself. Over the next 3 months, She conducted her own investigation, hiring private detectives, studying archives, talking to witnesses of those events who were still alive. What she discovered shocked her even more than my initial revelations. In her grandfather's personal papers, stored in a bank safe, Mary found documents the family had hidden from her all her life. Correspondence with lawyers, receipts for payments to witnesses, copies of false medical reports. But most shocking was a letter from Judge Harold Milligan, who had handled Dad's parental rights case. In the letter, dated November 1959, the judge thanked William Harris for a generous donation of $25,000 for building a new courthouse library and assured him that the case would be decided in the child's best interests. $25,000 in 1959 was a huge sum, equal to 10 workers' annual salary. The court had simply been bought. Mary also discovered records of her grandfather's negotiations with people who gave false testimony against Dad. Neighbors were bribed, some with money, others with promises of jobs at Harris factories. The doctor who diagnosed Evelyn with signs of violence was blackmailed. He had gambling debts, and Harris promised to cover them in exchange for the needed conclusion. But the most horrifying discovery was the truth about Evelyn's death. In her grandfather's archives, Mary found correspondence with a certain Joseph Flanagan, owner of a transportation company, who was Harris's business partner in several questionable deals. The letters revealed that Evelyn had accidentally learned about her father's tax evasion and money laundering schemes. She'd threatened to contact the tax service if he didn't stop the illegal activity. Flanagan solved the problem radically. He bribed the mechanic who serviced Evelyn's car, and the mechanic damaged the braking system so that an accident was inevitable. William Harris learned about this only after his daughter's death. But instead of punishing the killer, he decided to use the situation. In exchange for silence about who really stood behind the accident, Flanagan helped him get rid of the inconvenient son-in-law and gain full custody of the granddaughter. Mary held in her hands documents proving that her mother had been murdered, and the murder covered up by the people she'd considered loving grandparents all her life. When we met for the second time, Mary looked like someone who'd survived a personal catastrophe. She'd aged 10 years in those 3 months. Deep wrinkles had appeared around her eyes. The gray hair had become more noticeable. She said she'd lived her entire life in lies. Everything she believed in, everything she'd built her life on, all of it was deception. Her mother was murdered, her father was slandered and exiled, and she was raised by murderers and traitors. But worst of all was realizing that Dad had lived all these years, fought about her, loved her from afar, while she didn't even know he existed. She kept repeating that he died 3 years ago. 3 years ago. If she'd learned the truth even a year earlier, she could have met with him, talked, asked forgiveness for not searching for him. Tears rolled down her cheeks, the first tears I'd seen from this strong woman. She said she knew what the most terrible thing was. She'd spent her entire life proud of becoming a lawyer. She'd said she wanted to defend justice, fight for those oppressed by the powerful. But it turned out she herself was the result of the greatest injustice. Her career, her status, her wealth, all built on blood and lies. Mary made a decision that characterized her as a person of honor. She wanted to officially restore Dad's good name through the courts, even if it took years and cost millions of dollars. She said she couldn't bring him back to life, but she could restore his justice. Mary filed a lawsuit in Illinois District Court for posthumous rehabilitation of Thomas Harper and recognition of the October 30th, 1959 court decision as illegal. She hired the best lawyers specializing in reviewing old cases, hired private detectives to search for new evidence. The process dragged on for 2 years. Mary spent more than $500,000 of her own money on it. But money wasn't important to her. Truth was important. During the trial, they managed to find living witnesses to those events. James O'Malley, now 89 years old, had worked as a mechanic in the same auto shop as Dad. He testified that Tom never drank at work, that he was one of the most responsible and honest people he knew. The old man said in a trembling voice that Tom Harper was a good man. He adored his wife and daughter. When the accident happened, he was broken. And when they took his child away, he nearly lost his mind. He never believed those accusations. They also managed to find Mary Connolly, a woman who in 1959 had lived in the apartment next to the Harper family. She was now 92 years old, but her memory was clear. She said categorically that those people in court were lying. She'd lived wall to wall with the Harpers for 2 years. She never heard any screaming or fighting. Tom and Evelyn were a very quiet, decent couple, and their girl was well-behaved, always clean, and well cared for. The most important witness was Patrick Finnegan, son of the very mechanic who, on Flanagan's orders, had damaged the brakes in Evelyn's car. Old Finnegan died in 1987, but before his death, confessed to his son what he'd done. Patrick told them his father had been tormented by this his entire life. He said Flanagan had threatened to kill their entire family if he didn't do what was required. But later, when he learned that a young woman had died in the car and her child was left an orphan, he couldn't forgive himself. Finnegan had even saved his father's note, where the old man detailed exactly what he'd done to Evelyn's car's braking system. The court carefully studied all evidence, questioned experts, cross-referenced archival documents. Judge Elizabeth Zhang, a woman of Asian descent known for her principles and incorruptibility, conducted the proceedings with exceptional thoroughness. On October 15, 2023, exactly 64 years after Evelyn Harris's death, the court issued a historic decision. The court ruling of October 30th, 1959 was declared illegal, based on false testimony, witness bribery, and corruption in the judicial system. Thomas Harper was posthumously exonerated and found innocent of all charges brought against him. Moreover, the court officially recognized that Evelyn Harris's death was the result of premeditated murder organized by Joseph Flanagan on behalf of unidentified parties. Judge Zhang, announcing the verdict, said this case demonstrated how wealth and influence can pervert justice and destroy innocent lives. Thomas Harper was a victim of systemic corruption that deprived him of his daughter and forced him to live in exile. Today, more than half a century later, justice had finally triumphed. But for us, this was a bitter victory. Dad had died without seeing vindication. He'd left this world considering himself a failure who couldn't protect his own child. After the trial, Mary insisted the story reach the media. Journalists from the Chicago Tribune and Boston Globe wrote extensive articles about how an influential family stole a child from an innocent father. The story caused a nationwide sensation. St. Catherine's Academy officially apologized to Mary for hiding the truth about her parents. The law firm that had represented the Harris family's interests in 1959 issued a statement condemning their predecessors' actions. But what mattered most to Mary was something else. She wanted to learn everything about Dad, what kind of person he was, how he'd lived all these years, what he felt, what he dreamed about. I told her everything I remembered. How Dad never complained about life, though he worked physically demanding jobs until retirement. How every year in October, the month of Evelyn's death, he became especially quiet and thoughtful, and Mom and I knew not to bother him during those times. How he taught me to always tell the truth, even when it was disadvantageous. How he helped neighbors fix their cars for free if he knew they couldn't afford it. How he never spoke badly of wealthy people, though he had every reason to hate them. I told her how he said wealth doesn't make people bad. Greed and lack of conscience make them bad. He taught me to judge people not by how much money they had, but by how they spent it. Mary listened to these stories with the hunger of someone trying to make up for lost years. She cried when I told her how Dad was proud of my school achievements, how he rejoiced when I got into college, how he worried when I had problems. She said he was the kind of father she'd always dreamed of, understanding, fair, loving, and she hadn't even known he existed. Most painful for Mary was realizing she'd unconsciously searched for paternal love her entire life. Her marriage to Richard Campbell, a man 15 years older, her desire for approval from male mentors, her choice of a profession where she had to fight for justice, all these were attempts to find what she'd lost at age 5. She said she knew the strangest thing. She'd spent her entire life specializing in corporate law, defending large companies' interests, but it turned out she should have been defending families oppressed by the wealthy and powerful, as if she'd chosen the wrong side in the war that destroyed her own family. Mary decided to radically change her life. She left the large corporate firm and founded a nonprofit organization called the Thomas Harper Foundation, which helps families victimized by judicial system corruption. The foundation provides free legal help to people who can't afford quality attorneys, helps review unjust court decisions, fights for children's rights in custody disputes. She said she couldn't change the past, but she could ensure that what happened to our family wouldn't happen to others. We began meeting regularly. Mary met my children, her nephews, who were thrilled by their unexpectedly wealthy aunt. She in turn introduced me to her children and grandchildren. Her son Tom, a cardiac surgeon at Massachusetts General Hospital, was shocked to learn the truth about their family history. Her daughter Evelyn, a Harvard Business School professor, couldn't believe their entire family history had been a lie. But the grandchildren accepted me more easily. To them, I was simply new Grandma Catherine, who told interesting stories about Grandpa Tom, whom they'd never known. The most touching moment came when Mary's 10-year-old grandson Michael asked why Grandpa Tom had never visited them. Mary explained that he couldn't. Bad people had forbidden him from seeing Grandma Mary, but he'd always loved them and thought about them. The boy asked if they could visit him now to tell him they loved him too. That's how the idea of erecting a monument to Dad was born. Mary insisted on installing it at the Ohio cemetery where Dad was buried, next to Mom's grave. The black granite monument was simple but dignified. It bore the inscription that Thomas Harper was a loving husband, father, and grandfather, and that his love had overcome the injustice of time. Below were lines Mary had written herself, asking forgiveness for not knowing the truth for so long. and assuring him that now his family was together again. At the monument's dedication ceremony, our entire united family gathered, children and grandchildren who finally learned the true story of their grandfather and great-grandfather. We brought flowers and photographs, Evelyn with little Mary, Dad with Mom on their wedding day, family pictures from different generations. Mary gave a speech, her voice trembling with emotion. She addressed Papa, saying they'd come to tell him they knew the truth. They knew how he'd loved them. They knew how he'd fought for them. They knew what choice he'd had to make and why he'd made it. They weren't angry at him for disappearing. They were angry at those who'd forced him to do it. But most importantly, she wanted him to know his family was together again. His daughters had found each other. His grandchildren and great-grandchildren were growing up knowing the truth about what a wonderful person he'd been. His love had defeated their lies. After the ceremony, we stood by the grave for a long time, each lost in our own thoughts. I thought about how strangely life is arranged. Dad had left this world considering himself a failure who'd lost his daughter. But in reality, he'd raised 2 daughters so that one could find the other and restore justice 60 years after the crime. The trunk now sits in Mary's living room, but it's no longer a repository of secrets. It's a reminder that truth always finds a way to surface, even if it takes decades. Every year in October, on the anniversary of Evelyn's death, Mary and I visit the cemetery. We bring flowers and tell Dad about our lives, our children, our grandchildren, how his foundation is developing. Last year, Mary said something that made me cry. She thinks Papa won, after all. They thought they'd destroyed our family forever. But love is stronger than hatred. Truth, stronger than lies. Papa's love waited for its moment and brought us together again. And she was right. The Harris family had used all their wealth and influence to separate father from daughter. But in the end, it was their very crime that led to the truth surfacing and justice prevailing. The Thomas Harper Foundation has helped restore justice in 27 cases over 3 years of operation. 27 families who suffered from corruption and abuse received help and were able to reunite. But the most important legacy of this story was how it changed us. Mary understood that money and status mean nothing if they're not used for good deeds. She became a completely different person, softer, more humane, more just. And I understood that my father was an even more remarkable person than I'd thought. He chose peace over revenge, his daughter's safety over his own justice. And even losing one daughter, he managed to raise the other so she could find the first and set everything right. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Dad had lived a few more years and witnessed our reunion with Mary. But then I realize he'd already achieved his goal. He'd preserved the family even when it seemed to no longer exist. The trunk in the attic turned out to be more than just a storage place for old things. It was a message from Dad, a message that love is stronger than fear, that truth always defeats lies, that a family can be separated but never truly destroyed, and most importantly, that sometimes we need to lose something to find something even more precious. Mary and I lost Dad, but we found each other. And now his legacy lives not only in our memories, but in the good deeds we do in his memory. Every time the foundation helps reunite a separated family, every time justice triumphs, every time children find lost parents or parents find lost children, I know that somewhere Dad is smiling and proud that his daughters are continuing his work. Isn't that the meaning of life? To transform the love we receive into the love we give. Dad showed us how to love despite everything. Now it's our turn to pass that love forward.